What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I'm Jordan, joined with Jared, and we have a special returning guest today, Dr. Steve Mason, returning again. I think we talked to you probably like 6 months ago, Steve.
Yeah, at least 6 months ago, I think. Time's flying, I don't know. But anyway, nice to be back with you. Thank you. I'm really honored to be with you.
It was a blast last time. We'll put a link in the description of last time we talked about the Josephus reference to James and kind of the background of Josephus and how it's best interpreted. And so that was really excellent. So again, link in the description will be for that one. Today, though, we're going to be shifting our focus kind of a little bit further out. We're going to be talking about life in Judea under Roman rule. So people tend to have this perception of how life, maybe how they saw it in like their Sunday school class, or maybe a movie with like a Roman soldier scowling on every corner at people who passed and that sort of thing. And so because of this horrible, oppressive rule of Rome, eventually the Jewish people rose up in rebellion and then they were utterly crushed. But that is the view that a lot of people have of how life was under the Romans. But there's good reason to think that maybe that's not actually true. And maybe life wasn't all that bad for the Jewish people under the Romans. And so Steve was kind enough to come on and share his expertise on that. But before we jump into that, in case someone missed last time, Steve, why don't you take a second and introduce yourself and what you've been working on?
Okay. Thank you very much. As I said, it's really great to be with you guys. I enjoyed it very much last time. I like the atmosphere here, so thank you. I hope this is useful. Basically, I'm a historian of the Roman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean particularly, and focus on the Levant, or Syria, Judea, and how the Romans governed, and from the Jewish side, how life was. So I've published a bunch on these things. I've written a big fat book, it's too fat, on the history of the Jewish War against Rome, 66 to 74, from Cambridge University Press, and a few other things relevant to these questions. So this is what I work on. I also edit an edition of the works of Flavius Josephus, who's the major historian for this period. You guys will know this already. And if you watched our previous chat, it was about his treatment of this very small subject, really just one paragraph, even half a sentence on Jesus' brother James. So yeah, as was just said, we're branching out big scope today to look at the whole picture of life in Judea.
I think it's important when people read the Bible or engage with it, not just the Bible, any ancient text. Everything that's ever been written was written in a particular context, and the people writing it were writing it for the people that were around at that time who had also been familiar with that context. And so if you don't understand at least something about the context in which it was written, you're going to be missing a lot of the meaning that the authors would have been assuming. And so that's why I think this kind of talk is important, and also just super interesting because Rome, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm a huge geek for Rome, so I'm very excited. Okay. Steve, you said you put together a presentation, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I know when we set this up, you guys had some questions that you wanted to talk with me about, and it occurred to me that with this kind of issue, just as you said, that you need to have some kind of context, and the best way I can think of as a teacher to give this kind of context is with some maps and some visuals as well. So I hope you don't mind. Rather than just making word pictures, I tried to illustrate clearly as possible the kind of points I want to make. So let's get into it then. The standard picture is the one you just described, which is this kind of serious tension between Imperial Rome and Jerusalem right from the beginning. So some people will say that begins from when Rome arrived in the region in 63 BCE, or from when King Herod and then his son King Herod died in 4 BCE. His son Archelaus then took over for a decade. He was kicked out. So at least from direct Roman rule, again in 6 CE, this is the most common view, that the Jews simply couldn't bear it because it was oppressive. They couldn't, take this constant hammering from Rome even King Herod had been a Rome imposed tyrant on them, so they didn't really like him that much. But once he was out of the picture, according to the standard idea, you have all these revolutionary groups. You who are watching this probably know their names, at least some of them, the Zealots, the Sicarii, the knife-wielding assassins. Judas the Galilean is thought to have been the founder of these rebel groups. And on the other side, Rome hated and oppressed the Jews. It was hostile in the usual picture. And you see this in films, right? All the big films like Ben-Hur, through The Life of Brian, even, you know, as was just said, The Life of Brian, you got Roman soldiers standing around everywhere in a comical version. But those guys, Monty Python, really did their research, and they were reflecting common views at the time when they came out in the late 70s, I guess. So the idea is there were repeated provocations on both sides. The Romans just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and squeezing the Jews until in a 66 CE, so 6 decades after this, they couldn't take anymore, even though it was a totally irrational revolt. It was one of desperation. That was the only possible explanation of why the Jews would revolt as a nation against Rome, because they couldn't hope to, you know, put down the Roman Empire. So things must have been absolutely terrible before 66. The cork popped on this, you know, from this pressure, and this led to a bloody, long war. So here's, I'm not going to name names because there's no point in doing that because these are such common views. But here's a recent 2021 book, a scholar writing, it clearly took a massive effort for the Romans to defeat all of the Jewish rebels. The fighting lasted for 8 or 9 years. That is from 66 to 74, 75 in his calculation. And there were tens of thousands of Jewish, Roman, and other casualties. So the idea, you see, is that this is kind of the main argument, that the war was so bad, so protracted, so bloody, so costly, lasted so long, that it must have been caused by unbearable tension that could not be resolved in any other way. Now, if you think about it, if you are interested in history, of course, this is already a doubtful proposition that the scope of a war can tell you what caused the war, right? I mean, First World War, many conflicts around the world that are Iraq, Afghanistan, doesn't mean there were actually really serious, you know, bilateral conflicts between two nations that reached a boiling point. There are all sorts of reasons that wars erupt. And in fact, if anybody's interested in following this up, an author named A.J.P. Taylor, a British historian who was active writing 60s, 70s, 80s, very popular. Any of his books on the causes of war are quite illuminating this way, because you see that, I mean, the main point is hardly anybody wanted to go to war. That's the point. So just right off the bat, we should be doubtful about this this explanation, I think. I mean, it could be that things boiled over. Of course, we have to see what the evidence is. That's one possibility, but we shouldn't assume that just because there was a big war, if there was a big war, that this was caused by a big bilateral tension. So yeah, I've already introduced my research, and that leads me to this kind of picture. First of all, a very quick overview of the war itself. Was it an 8 or 9 year bloody conflict? Well, that big fat book I wrote on the war is really an investigation of particular problems. It's not meant to be an authoritative narrative. This is how it happened. It's an exploration of each of half a dozen big problems. And what I end up discovering in that book, I didn't know when I began it, it was a research project, is that there was very little violent confrontation during these 8 or 9 years, from 66 to 74. So let's quickly run through them. It began in 66. There was a police action by the Syrian governor, Cestius Gallus, who came down expecting to be admitted into Jerusalem because there had been growing tensions in the city, he expected to resolve them. He was rebuffed. He wasn't allowed in the city. Walled cities have gates, couldn't get in. So he turned around and went home after a week. And this doesn't seem to have been a war. This was just his job as a kind of, order keeper to try to get things under control. Anyway, when his force departed, it was ambushed by Jewish militants in the Beit Horon Pass, and many soldiers were killed. But this was, I think, a police action. And then he either died or, he faded from view very soon. And the Emperor Nero sent Vespasian to Galilee. And Vespasian found that as soon as he arrived, even before he got into Galilee, the leaders of Galilee, the Jewish leaders, came and greeted him and said, "We don't want any trouble. Could you install a garrison in our capital city, Sepphoris, a Roman garrison, please, because we really don't want any trouble." And archaeology confirms that this actually happened. So there was no fighting there. Vespasian and his army basically frolicked around Galilee, burning villages and doing what legions do, and took vengeance for the ambush of Cestius Gallus. But that was all done by July 1st. The biggest siege there, they besieged the town of Yotapata, or Yotfat in Israel today. And they besieged it quickly, a few weeks, and that was it. Vespasian considered his time in Galilee successful. It was all done. It's all sealed up. He was headed to Jerusalem to solve the problems there, because that's really the only place where there were big issues. But King Agrippa, his friend who had accompanied him throughout the whole time, he had some troubles. He had his own troubles in cities that belonged to him as king. They were not anti-Roman revolts, they were anti-him, people unhappy with his rule. And he said, so Vespasian had already sent his army off to winter quarters in July of 67. And Agrippa said to him, "You know what? You've got this big army here doing nothing, and I've got these problems in Tiberias by the lake. Could you come and help me?" And Vespasian said, "Well, you're such a generous guy. You gave me great hospitality. So sure, I'll recall my army and I'll put down this trouble for you." But it was not anti-Roman trouble. This Tiberias over on the Lake of Galilee wasn't even on Vespasian's agenda. So he went and suppressed that stuff in Tiberias and Gamla. Gamla, there was a siege, the last of the rebels under Agrippa I. And that was it. So he moved down to Judea in the south, right? Planning.
Let me interrupt you for a second, Steve.
Yeah.
Just okay. So, 2 questions before we move on to the rest of the agenda. Who is King Agrippa?
So thanks for asking. Some of these names I work with every day, and I forget that they're not household names.
Oh, totally. So, like when I gave a presentation on nuclear safety the other day, and I always, whenever I'm doing that, I first give it to my wife to give you you need to explain this, you need to explain that.
Good move. Yeah, good move. Well, Agrippa, he's a really interesting guy. I mean, fascinating. He's a great grandson of King Herod the Great, in short. So the Herodian dynasty, and this will come up in the rest of what I want to say as soon as I get through this war business, that the Herodian family, each generation of them, continued to have great influence with the Romans. They were, tight friends. They grew up in Rome. The boys were sent to be educated in Rome, and they were tight with the Roman rulers. And this affected the status of Judea, because they are Judean royalty, right? So from the Roman point of view, they have a strong connection there. So yeah, King Agrippa had been given these cities as a gift by the young Nero. Nero came to power at age 16, right, in 54 CE. And he had been launched into power by his mother, Agrippina, who was widely thought to have arranged the death of Claudius, the emperor, so that her son could come to power. Anyway, he comes to power and he continues Claudius's generosity toward the Jews. because of their. So in fact, Agrippa II's father, Agrippa I, not surprisingly, he grew up in Rome and was in Rome when the emperor Gaius Caligula was assassinated. And so the question of who would be the new emperor turned out to be Claudius, was helped along by Agrippa I. This is amazing, right? There's a Jewish king in Rome, and he actually, because he has good ties with the Senate and with the imperial family, he facilitates the elevation of Claudius as emperor. That's amazing, right? So Claudius also owed Agrippa, the Agrippa family, the family of Herod, he owed them something. And so anyway, when Nero comes to power, he's still a kid, and he gives as a gift, he can give anything he wants. So he gives Agrippa II these lakeside cities of Tiberias, which is kind of a resort town with hot baths and things like that, and Tarichaea, an hour's walk to the north by the lakeside, beautiful town, also known as Magdala or Migdal in Hebrew. So these are Agrippa's places, but Agrippa is a new boy in town for them. And these are very prosperous cities by the lake and, business, active business centers, fishing, fish processing, trade across the lake and all that. And so when Agrippa II becomes their owner, their people are not too pleased about it. It means a kind of diminution of status for them. So the sailors who operate on the lake are unhappy with Agrippa, and that's what this is about. So Agrippa asks Vespasian, "Hey, you've got this massive army. Would you mind helping me out? Intimidate a little bit, smarten people up?" And he says, "Sure, glad to do it."
I get the sense that the Romans were quite good at that sort of intimidation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's really the main purpose of the legions, right? As perhaps armies today, superpower armies today, is you don't really want to use them if you don't have to, right? I mean, they're expensive to train and to maintain. The deterrent power is the main point of them, right? That
rattling a saber is a lot cheaper than swinging it.
Yeah, mess with us, we can clobber you, we can pulverize you. And that should be enough. You don't need to test it, right? So, yeah, I mean, if a few thousand, Vespasian arrived with an army of 60,000, apparently, which is, I think, somewhat larger than Canada's armed forces today. And this is just in Galilee. So, if they arrive outside your town, all in their shining gear and all that, I think most people would feel, yeah, let's do what they ask.
These Romans aren't so bad after all.
Yeah. I always liked the Romans. Yeah. Yeah. So it didn't go so smoothly. I mean, there were some diehards, but they were quickly scattered. Yeah. So that's Agrippa. Did you have another question?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. But please feel free to interrupt. Okay, I'm going to run through this very quickly because what happens next is simply that Nero dies, and Vespasian is already planning in the summer of 68 because everything's gone very smoothly for him. So he's now planning what he's going to do with Jerusalem after it, gave his predecessor Cestius Gallus such a hard time. So he's planning some kind of siege, and he goes back to coastal Caesarea to plan the siege when he hears that Nero has committed suicide at around age 30. So he has no choice but to put his campaign on hold. And he does this for nearly 2 years because now what happens is you have a Roman civil war, the year of the four emperors, where, Galba, Otto, and Vitellius compete with each other, succeed one another. And eventually Vespasian himself decides on the basis of his Eastern successes that he can bid for imperial power, and he becomes the emperor and goes to Alexandria late in 69 over that winter. So he leaves his young son to take the siege of Jerusalem, which obviously he considers not such a terrifying prospect. Otherwise, he would have done it himself with a large army. He sends most of his army off to Italy to fight in the civil wars. and leaves Titus to besiege Jerusalem. And when it's done, the war's over as far as the Romans are concerned. That's it. And they celebrate, they make Judea into a province now, Flavian province. They send governors, the first one, Cerealis, now with a legion. They celebrate their triumph in Rome, which is quite unjustified. It's a sort of sham triumph because they didn't really add any, and they didn't add any territory to the Roman Empire, which is supposed to be the condition of holding a triumph. But anyway, they pretended that they did. And they created a new province out of southern Syria called Judea. And so you have this succession of later governors. And I say all this simply to point out that if you look at this whole picture, there wasn't that much over these 8 or 9 years. There wasn't actually, it wasn't like a continuous bloody conflict. That's just a mistaken impression. Those spots I've marked there, the red ones, were the really bloody engagements. But even there, they were sieges, right? There were no pitched battles. So the Jews had no army. They weren't in a position to face down the Romans in the open field, of course. And their responses to Rome's arrival ranged among three options. One was they welcomed them, like the elites of Sepphoris and Perea across the Jordan River. Or the rural folk living in the towns, they just fled in fear, as you would expect, because they just saw this massed army arriving, which only knows how to kill people and break things, right? That's what armies do. So they just are terrified, and they run to the walled cities for at least momentary protection. Still happens today in the news every day. And then the Romans show up and besiege the towns until they surrender. And don't usually destroy them if they surrender. Then that's it. So Vespasian is finished his main project in Galilee, and within a couple of months of arriving there. But he helps his friend. Then he goes off and he plans the siege of Jerusalem, suspends his campaign. So this war, the really intensive part, and what the Romans considered, what the Flavians considered their big war, was the siege of Jerusalem. Didn't last 8 or 9 years. So we can't reason from, this is my whole opening point. I hope you're still with me. The main point is you can't argue from this terrifying 8 or 9 year bloodfest of a war that the causes of it must have been, just searingly unresolvable and awful if a nation would go to war. You can't reason that way.
And even if you did, as you kind of alluded to in the beginning, that would be the proportionality bias, where people assume big things must have big causes.
Right.
But it's entirely possible that they could have had a small thing that kind of just gets out of hand and things go up.
Yeah.
But it seems like you don't even have the big thing at the end anyways.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Yeah, thank you. Exactly right. This proportionality bias is really a curious thing, right? But yeah, you know it in all aspects of life, not just ancient history. Another big problem that I think confuses us, and we need to get this sorted out right from the start. We need to kind of adjust our thinking, and that's why I went with this presentation with some maps. Because if you look around the internet, where I got this Wikimedia map on the left side here, it's called Judea province in the first century. If you look at it, what does it comprise? Well, same if you look in the Oxford Bible Atlas on the right side. This is one called Palestine in New Testament times. The other one calls it the Judea province in the first century. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that on both of them, Judea is actually just a little area, right, within the map. 2/3, 3/4 of the way down, but they still call the whole thing Judea. And it looks very much like, well, this is also even from the Cambridge Ancient History here. You see, this is called the map of Judea. You see exactly the same thing. Judea is this little bit in the, lower part, but the whole thing is called the map of Judea. And it looks suspiciously like this from the government of the state of Israel, a map of Israel with Palestine in it. So what we have this conception that there's a unified territory there. We call it the Holy Land. We call it Israel, Palestine. Some people call it the Land of Israel. But it's just this one thing, right? That kind of looks like the state of Israel and Palestine today. But what I'm trying to suggest today is that in the first century, before 70, so that's an anachronistic picture, is what I'm trying to say. That actually the map looks like this. And you have many components. First of all of these cities, or polis in ancient terminology. That lower one without a name, the name disappeared, should be Gaza, actually. Gaza, Ascalon, Azotus, Joppa, Yamnia, Apollonia, Caesarea, Dora, Ptolemais, Akko. And then inland, these are the so-called Decapolis cities, Scythopolis, Hippos, Gadara, Avila, Pella, Gerasa, Philadelphia. Amman in Jordan today is Philadelphia. And Gerasa, if anyone has the chance to go there, it's called Jerash today in Jordan. It's an amazing site of the ancient city. So these are very ancient cities, many of them older than Jerusalem. That is, David, according to the Bible, took Jerusalem around 1000 BCE. So some of these cities are several thousand years BCE. They had populations in them. So they're very old, very established, very much not Jewish. Even in biblical times, they have their own calendars, their own gods, their own customs, their own ways of worship, their ways of dress and eating, and their whole own civil structure and self, identity, understanding of themselves, and so on, and very much not Jewish. So Judea, it was this area in this southern part of the Levant, but it was always distinct from these other areas. So these next ones I'll mention, these are big ethnic areas. So Perea just means across. So it's across the Jordan. And it's called Perea because from the Judean point of view, the overflow population settled in Perea across the river. And Galilee as well. Galilee had been non-Jewish, but it was settled by Jews, as we'll see. Samaria had always been at odds with Judea. So according to the Bible, even way back in the biblical story, David united this whole area under his rule. But even then, by 922 BCE, the northern kingdom, for those of you who know the biblical story, the northern kingdom broke away from the southern kingdom. So it was like Judah and Israel. Israel was the northern kingdom. And then in 721, the Assyrians besieged Samaria and took away its elite population, took away much of its population, repopulated according to the biblical story. And so you have the emergence of a kind of half Jewish population, but that is at odds with the Judean population in the south. So Samaria will become, and this is essential to what I'm talking about today, will become a big thorn in the flesh of Judea right through the first century. That's why you have, in the Gospels, the story of, wow, the Good Samaritan. How could there be a Good Samaritan from a Judean point of view? That's because these two are at odds. And in John chapter 4, you have the story of the woman, the woman of Samaria who meets Jesus and is puzzled. Why are you talking to me? And then they have this little discussion of the conflict between Samaria and Judea. And it's represented in various sources, also in Tacitus, the historian, Josephus. Everybody talks about this conflict. And then Idumea to the south is another big ethnic zone. It took the name from Edom, or Edom, which was farther south and across the river down to the south. But its name kind of crept over into this region, Idumea. And it has also a complex relationship with Judea, for reasons that we're about to see. So the main point here is that we need to adjust our thinking right away. Judea, in ancient terminology, and this is not only Jews writing like Philo and Josephus, but also outsiders like Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, geographers, Pliny. When they look at the region, they see Judea as an ethnic zone the Judeans or Jews. This is their homeland. It's the hinterland, the agricultural territory of the city of Jerusalem. Just like Athens had its territory, Attica, right? And Sparta had its big territory, Laconia. So Jerusalem had its supporting territory around where farms grew produce that were brought into the city, and that was called Judea. And so everybody knew it was a famous place. Everybody knew that Judea followed certain traditions that were different from other people's traditions, and so on. But it was not like Judea was a province. It was not this whole southern Syria. And we should get that clear in our minds, that there were all of these other very old places around. So we move on to have a quick historical overview of what was the background then to the situation in the first century. Well, David supposedly took Jerusalem from the Canaanites, Jebusites in 1000 BCE. The city was destroyed in 586 BCE by the Neo-Babylonians. And this is the time of the so-called exile, right? The big exile of Judeans to Babylon by the rivers of Babylon. Boni M song, I think. There, we sat down. It's a great song, I think, still. Anyway, they were allowed to rebuild their city under Persian rule. Cyrus the Persian allowed, famously, he was in the Bible, it says he was God's anointed in Isaiah, to allow the Jews to come back and rebuild their city and then eventually their temple. And in that period, then Jerusalem is a very small, the city of Jerusalem is a very small temple state. Some scholars, some Israeli scholars, have estimated the population, the male population, somewhere between 500 and 1,000, whole population, just really a couple of thousand. Notice that by this time, Samaria is already established, right? So it is the big brother in town. And it's, even in the biblical story, it's hostile to Jerusalem rebuilding its temple, because they have their own, well, they're going to have their own temple built in the 5th century on Mount Gerizim. And they see themselves as the true descendants of, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they've melded somehow a new iteration of biblical life. And this is the Samaritan way of doing things. So as I said, Judea is just the territory of this temple polis or temple state, temple city. Until the 160s BCE, the Samaritan situation was calling the shots. And so the city of Samaria, which is that little blue dot there, it was ideally situated for the military garrison of the ruling power, whoever it was, because it was very easy to get to from the coastal plain. You could ride up, and then you were on top of this big hill which had views in every direction. And so Samaria was really the governing area administratively. And Mount Gerizim, which is this massive, tall mountain, the Bible talks about Eval and Gerizim as these two mountains in Samaria. It's this huge mountain, and kind of closer to God. That's where this temple was built. And in the early 2nd century BC, it's really flourishing. Archaeology has shown all these votive inscriptions and sacrificial remains and things like that. They didn't sacrifice pork, pigs, just like Israel didn't, or Judea didn't. But Jerusalem is small and vulnerable. And what happens, of course, at that time, we don't have time to get into it. This is the time of the Maccabean revolt, because the king Antiochus IV, who's a Seleucid king, and the Seleucids are controlling this area in the 160s, he decides, for whatever reason, he seems to be in league with the Jerusalem priestly leadership. They want to kind of Hellenize. They want to make their culture more Greek. And he agrees with that and supports them. But there's a massive revolt led by this rural priestly family called the Hasmoneans. And they are very conservative at the beginning, at least, and they don't want this. They see it as a betrayal, and so they murder a couple of the king's representatives, and they gradually begin a revolt. Now, at this time, the Seleucid regime is also crumbling. Like it had controlled all the way almost to India, through the Middle East and all the way up through Syria. So it initially had this massive empire, which is now in this period, in the middle of the 2nd century BC, is crumbling. So the Hasmoneans are able, not only by their own sheer energy and force, but also by alliances with competing Seleucid royal pretenders. So Seleucids who want to be king, they say, look, we'll help you if you help us. And so by this means of alliances, they rapidly gain territory. And if you think about international relations today, if you follow the school of thought called realist, which holds that there's no overarching power among nations, no just judge among nations that will sort out interstate rivalries. Each state has to just get what it can and be as strong as it can. What happens now under the Hasmoneans kind of follows a realist playbook. That is, they say, well, we were vulnerable. We were almost wiped out by Antiochus IV when he tried to put down our people because we would not Hellenize. He tried to extinguish Jewish tradition, Jewish laws. We can't be that weak again, never again. So we need to expand. We need to become strong. We need to become, wealthy enough to hold, to be a power in our own right, to call our own destiny. And John Hyrcanus, who governed the Hasmoneans from 134 to 104 BCE, he added tremendously to their territory. So Jerusalem is no longer this small temple state. He adds Idumea to the south. And what he requires of people who are taken over by the Jews is the following. Josephus describes it. He captured the polis of Adora and Marissa in Idumea. And when he had taken all the Idumeans in hand, he let them stay if they would circumcise their genitals, that is, the males, and if they were willing to live under Judean laws. Because of their yearning for their ancestral land, he said, Josephus writing, 100, 200 years later, says they patiently submitted to circumcision and to practicing the very same regimen of life as the Judeans. From that time onward, they were Judeans. Well, this is a bit more complicated than that, but that's basically it. They said, yeah, okay, we'll follow Judean law. It's a little bit like in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, the agreement when the Germans unified and took over Alsace-Lorraine from the French. They said they gave them an ultimatum, the people who lived there. You've got a year or a few months to decide: are you going to stay and be German, or are you French? You can leave. You stay under our laws, take on our identity, or you go. And if you follow the Dreyfus case, Alfred Dreyfus in the 1890s, his family had come from Alsace-Lorraine. He had fled from Alsace-Lorraine to Paris. So this kind of thing is not strange in history, is what I'm trying to say. When a power takes over an area, say, okay, these are the laws now. You live under them, or you leave. And as it happens, we have a lot of inscriptions from Egypt at this time, from Idumean communities that fled from Idumea, southwest over to Egypt and reestablished themselves, worshiping their ancestral god, who was not the Jewish god, right? The god Kos was their god. Sorry?
It's interesting that when Jerusalem, first of all, the picture you kind of get from just like Sunday school is that Jerusalem has always been this strong militant power. And in fact, they kind of were the second fiddle to the Sumerians for a long time.
Yeah.
But then after this, they conquered all the area that we kind of conceptualize as Israel. So now it's Judea. But then they do to the Idumeans and others, I think, kind of the sort of thing that people picture the Romans doing.
Right.
So like the shoe is almost on the other foot. They're like, if you want to be here, you're going to be Jewish. You're going to live like we do.
But the Romans didn't do that. That's that's inherent in your observation. Yeah.
Well, they have the conception of what the Romans did.
Right.
but perhaps not the reality of how the Romans actually did.
Yeah, because the Romans had a completely different way of looking at things, which we're about to get to. But yeah, thank you, exactly so. Um, so now some scholars have tried to minimize all this and say, they weren't so bad. They didn't really, impose their laws so severely. I mean, who knows? We just have accounts of what they did. The biggest expansion was then under Alexander Jannaeus from 103 to 76, and he made extensive use of mercenary forces. So he was now wealthy enough that he could purchase, an army to help him do this. Partly because he was facing increasing hostility from his home population, because these guys had also taken on the high priesthood, right? So the Hasmoneans were both rulers and high priests. And of course, the high priest is supposed to maintain a state of purity, which means you don't touch corpses, for example. You don't have it, you don't come into contact with dead bodies. So here's a guy who's both a general, commanding armies, conquering territory, and serving as high priest. So there are multiple sources that talk about the animosity of the people towards him, and him even lining up and crucifying the people that were rebelling against him in front of their families, the men who were rebels against him, criticizing his rule. So he used mercenaries in part to, and one of the great paradoxes is too, by this point, the Hasmoneans are kind of fully Greek. So initially, a century before, the rebellion had happened against the Hellenization of the upper class priesthood that was willing to go with, Graicization, the Greekization of their culture. By this point, the Hasmoneans are themselves very Greek. We can see it on their coins and in the remains that they have left, that they hire mercenaries. They are a very Greek-style court, even taking Greek names. So it's kind of paradoxical. But anyway, Alexander Jannaeus expanded to the maximum limit for a brief period, for a couple of decades. And then he dies while on campaign in the East, and his wife, Alexandra Salome, known as Alexandra Salome or Shalom Zion in Hebrew, takes over from him. Now, how did the outsiders view all this? What was going on? Well, we don't have their real time testimony, but we do have, not too long afterwards, accounts by outsiders who were not Jewish looking at this thing, and their words are preserved in later writers. So, for example, Pompeius Trogus, who's from the 1st century BCE, he's not that much later than Alexander Jannaeus. He says that this Seleucid ruler, Antiochus Sidetes, who died in 129 BC, he reduced the Judeans who, during the Macedonian rule under his father, had recovered their freedom by force of arms. Their strength was such that after him they would submit to no Macedonian king. They elected their own rulers, and they harassed Syria with fierce wars. Strabo, the famous geographer, said, he's writing at the end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century CE, some Judeans breaking away from Seleucid rule ruined the countryside, theirs and that of the neighboring peoples. Others, working with their leaders, stole by force what belonged to others and subdued much of Syria and Phoenicia. Yet somehow they left their own Acropolis, Jerusalem, just fine, using it as a base of tyranny. So these are obviously hostile accounts, right? And even Tacitus mentions this a century later. Their despotism regained by force of arms. They overthrew cities. They fostered their superstition and so on. Well, in any case, when the Romans then arrived, and they were invited in by two Hasmonean brothers who were squabbling with each other, they invited Pompey, the Roman general, who was in Syria, to come and help them sort out their conflict with each other. And of course, he said, well, I'm glad to. And in fact, since I'm here, why don't we just rearrange everything to Rome's satisfaction?
Who could have foreseen that could have gone poorly? Like who?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, we have a suggestion for you. Let's do things a little differently. So
Yeah.
what he did was, and he was, Pompey was advised by some people from the region. For example, one of his key advisors was from Gadara, which, if you see across the river there up in the north by the Sea of Galilee, Gadara just to the south, it had been destroyed by the Hasmoneans, right? So if these cities did not cooperate with them, they destroyed them. And this is also visible archaeologically in some cases, as with Gadara. So his friend, Pompey's friend, said, look what they did to our city. And Pompey was on the side of the local inhabitants. And this was part of Rome's way of doing things. So Rome, as we'll see in a moment, their whole way of governing, which would influence imperial powers such as Britain especially, and to some extent the U.S., in later times. I hope the audience doesn't mind my saying that the U.S. has an imperial outlook.
I mean, they can mind if they want, but that's just reality.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, I think so. I think it's not in dispute, really. But anyhow, the British certainly deliberately modeled themselves on the Romans. And the idea was a kind of small footprint, right? The idea is not, it's just too expensive to try to go and actually occupy foreign countries. I mean, who's going to do that? The Germans tried it in Europe, and it didn't really work very well. They were overstretched in World War II very quickly. And that was just within Europe. So there's absolutely no way you just don't have a professional army that you can send everywhere to occupy. So the way you rule, the way you govern is through local elites, right? You give them a stake in your project so that their well-being and your well-being are linked. And in fact, the Romans really innovated in this way. They were not more brutal than everybody else who tried to become an empire. They were just smarter in a practical sense. And what they said was, look, we can't dominate the whole, everything. Let's rather offer that these local elites, these local rulers, well, let's make them citizens of Rome. Let's say, hey, you want to be like us? You want to be citizens of Rome? Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, then now you have a stake in Rome's project. So look after it. Do well, and we'll reward you with ever greater, rewards. So that's what happened. And Pompey said, well, we're going to give back all these territories to the subject populations. Everybody who's been conquered by the Jews, we will restore those cities to their native inhabitants. And Josephus, although he's a very proud Judean priest, he talks about this. This is how he puts it. After depriving the nation, my nation, of the towns in Coele-Syria, that is southern Syria, that it had conquered, he placed these under a Roman commander, Scaurus. This is Pompey. He put a Roman commander in charge named Scaurus and confined the nation entirely within its proper or native Greek term gymnasio borders. He also rebuilt Gadara, which had been destroyed by the Judeans. Thus, he liberated the cities of the interior from them. Hippos, Scythopolis, Pella, Samaria, Yamnia, Marissa, Azotus, Arethusa, likewise the coastal towns. All these he gave back to their, same word, legitimate or native citizens, and assigned them to the new Roman province of Syria. In his later work, he puts it this way: we threw away our freedom and fell under subjection to Rome, and the territory that we had acquired by force of arms under the Hasmoneans, taking it away from the Syrians. So we took it away from the Syrians by force of arms. We were forced to give back to the Syrians because a greater power had arrived in town. This was the Romans. Now, a successor to Scaurus in the next decade, the 50s BCE, was Gabinius. And interestingly, he recognized on a practical level that there were, as a result of the Hasmonean expansion, there actually were now major Judean population centers outside of the old hinterland of Jerusalem. He recognized 5 of them, including Jerusalem, and he said, let's make these centers so the Judeans can have this territory where they are numerous, because they are. So that's just practical. And they now have an outlet to the sea, to the Mediterranean at Joppa, which the Hasmoneans had conquered. So Gabinius allowed them to keep the port city, or he restored to them the port city of Joppa, Jaffo. It goes by many names. Jaffa oranges from there, and part of Galilee. So Sepphoris as the capital, the central town of Galilee. So he allowed them to have these 5 toparchic centers. But within another decade and a half, Jerusalem is back in control of the whole of southern Syria. Why? Why did that happen?
That does seem odd because like the Romans come in and I would imagine it probably won them a lot of friends. They're like, hey, the Jews conquered all you people, but don't worry, we're going to put things back to rights, everyone back to where they belong. But as a kind of a consolation prize, Judeans, you still have access to the sea. Here's the places that you control. Okay, everybody's happy now. Pay your taxes to Rome, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And now it's back under Jerusalem's rule. Why? Well, because of this guy, King Herod. So, I mean, we don't have time to get into the whole story of Herod's family, but his father, Antipater, was a very smart guy. He's one of these kind of fellows who operates in the background, right, of the real rulers, like the official rulers. You know, every empire, every royalty has always had them, right? The real fixer, like Bismarck under Kaiser Wilhelm. Or I don't know, I maybe shouldn't say more contemporary names, but there are
Littlefinger in Game of Thrones.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, there's always, right, the fixer, the guy who's willing to get his hands dirty. And that was Antipater. He's a very shrewd fellow with regional connections. So there was a high priest that the Romans left in power. So when they sorted out this squabble between the 2 brothers, the one who they supported was a fellow named Hyrcanus II as high priest and ethnarch, or ruler of the people. But he needed some muscle behind him, and that was Antipater, the Idumean. So Antipater is from Idumea, but remember that Idumea has now, at least officially, taken on Judean laws, right? So it's kind of, and it the Idumeans worship in the Jerusalem temple. So there's already this cross-cultural link, right, connection with him, and he's got a connection with the Nabatean Arabs to the east, because he marries a Nabatean woman, and his family has connections with Ascalon, this port city. So he's a kind of cosmopolitan guy, and he's very capable, and he has several sons whom he raises, he grooms to be very powerful, and one of them is Herod, who at a young age is given responsibility under his dad to put down any kind of trouble up in Galilee, and he does it very effectively. So why did the Romans do this? Well, Herod rules from 37 to 4 BC, a long time, and he becomes best buddies with the new Roman emperor from 31 to 31 onward officially. Well, 27 onward, he's named Augustus. His original name was Octavian. But he and the guys before him, so already Mark Antony and Lepidus, agree that this Herod fellow is really somebody to watch. Now, the Romans have this idea, as I said, that if they can just find the right local rulers, that's a big load off their backs, right? So they don't have to worry about micromanaging the territory under them. They can leave it to some kind of ruler, and they know where he lives, so they just hold him responsible, right? And he takes over. So this is what they got with Herod. Herod was magnificently successful as a powerful ruler. They made him king in Rome. He went to Rome and received his, diadem, this cloth that you tie around the head, as king under Roman auspices. He is appointed in 40 BC, but it takes him 3 years to actually secure his territory. So we date his reign from 37 BC. Anyway, he dies in 4 BC. And even still, and this is a crucial point that I want to make with you, is that even still, when Herod dies, The Romans don't say, okay, let's look for some ruler from Ascalon or Gaza or Yamnia or Sepphoris or Scythopolis or, anywhere else. Let's stick with Jerusalem and stay with Herod's sons. And so Augustus, when his friend Herod dies in 4 BC, he gets a delegation from Jerusalem. Elders come to him and say, please, please, please don't leave us under a monarch. So these are the chief priests of Jerusalem, and they are really suffering under Herod because Herod has, absolute control and just tells everybody what to do. And they, the priests, traditionally have been the elite of the city. They used to have the power to judge cases, and they had considerable legal and social standing, and that's all squashed under Herod. So when Herod dies, they make a beeline to Rome and say, please, Emperor, don't put us under one of his sons. Just join us to Syria and let us be a normal city. And what that will mean for them is that they get their power back as elite rulers, right? The aristocracy. But Augustus, he likes the idea of Herodian rule so much, it's so straightforward and simple, and Herod was his buddy, that he follows Herod's will against the wishes of the aristocracy and says, okay, I'm going to put, his sons are only in their early 20s, and he thinks it's unwise to make one of them king like his father. So he divides up the kingdom, and he gives Archelaus, who seemed to have the strongest support of his father, he gives him the choice area of Judea, Samaria, right, the heartland of the kingdom. Antipas, he puts up in Galilee and gives him Perea, so non-contiguous territories. So he's the guy, right, who's in charge when Jesus is active. And then Philip, the other son, he gives him a more remote territory way up in the northeast. So as it happens, Antipas and Philip turn out to be extremely competent rulers, or so it seems, because they rule longer than their father. They actually rule for more than 3 decades with no apparent great trouble. But Archelaus manages to really piss off both of the Jerusalem leaders and the Samaritan leaders under his rule. And they both appeal to Augustus saying, please, please, please. And so Augustus finally relents and lets them become a normal city in southern Syria. Now, the question is why? What's going on here? What factors into Rome's calculation? Well, I think it's clear from the research that it's pretty clear that Augustus did not have, and his successors did not have, like a worked out theory, of empire. But it's also clear that they had certain instincts, which are not so strange if you think about it. Every empire tends to have these ever since the Romans. Namely, first of all, economy. You want to maximize your return for minimal investment, maximize your power, or in Roman terms, imperium, your control of things, but minimize your actual investment or the need for force, because that's just wasteful, right? If you have to keep beating people up, it's not helping the situation. So, figure out this sweet spot between getting the most bang for your buck and minimal investment of, say, your legionary force. The legions, they were only 28 of them under Augustus, and 3 of them were lost in Germany to a revolt there. So, and these are roughly 5,000, brigade size units. That's it for the entire Roman Empire, right? So you don't have legions to squander, and they take a lot of money, a lot of training. These are your elite force. And you want to keep them for the really hot spot areas and keep them grouped together where they can be a deterrent on those border frontier areas. So you want to mainly use them as we discussed already, to intimidate by threat of retaliation rather than as an occupying force. So you don't use them to occupy. Second, the reverse side of that is cultivate the local elites and maximize their autonomy, hold them responsible for, security and for stability, for peace. Give them Roman citizenship. Give them, even elevate them to equestrian status, right? The knight status in Roman terms. Give them a stake in Roman success. This is Rome's major innovation as a ruling power. Others did not do this. Other, like Greek states, did not do this. Third, rule by division. Of course, this is famous, right? Or a famous Roman principle. The way that you maintain your power is you don't allow all your subject peoples to gather together and talk about their grievances against you. You keep each of them dependent on you and in rivalry with each other for honor. So you deliberately honor this city over here and say, we're going to make you the prime city of the region. And everybody else says, what? We want to be the prime city. And so you get this rivalry going. And by having local antagonisms, you play one off against the other, and you minimize the chance that they're going to gang up and cause you any trouble. So prevent their sharing of grievances. But at the same time, there's a limit to that, right? What you don't want them to do is go fight each other, because that will just create a mess. So the idea is, the sweet spot again is, you want them all dependent on you individually they all want to be looking to you for their security, and you forbid them to go to war with each other, but you allow the tensions to simmer among them. I say these are instincts or reflexes just because they happen all the time, right? You'll hear, just pick up any newspaper or read online today, you'll hear constantly, that this power is ruling by division over the people under them. That's just what people do. It's a no-brainer. Prevent, however, any one Roman governor or senator from acquiring power. So keep their territories limited, right? Don't allow the territories to expand too large, because in the past and in the future, this will become a source of aggravation to emperors when, like Vespasian, right? He manages to seize power in a coup because he accumulates support in the eastern part of the empire. And then the most efficient way to do all of this is, you can do it through local elites, but the single most efficient way is to use one guy. Just find that one person who can wrap it all up in a bow for you, like King Herod, right? He's taking all the work away from you. So what you do is, the way you butter this up is you call it an alliance. The Romans did not use the language, we use the language of client kingship, right? We say Herod was a client king of Rome. But the Romans were smarter than that, right? Nobody wants to be a client. They want to be a king. So the Romans said, you are allies. I think maybe American rulers do this too, American officials, right? They always talk about our allies. They don't say our puppet. Right, we're going to visit our puppet.
They're just our allies who do exactly what we want in all situations. Yes. If they don't, it's big trouble.
They're just really good allies, right? They understand us. Yes, but the Romans were past masters at this already, right? They contracted treaties of friendship and alliance, and that's how they called people our beloved ally. So the
Romans are kind of like setting up franchises almost, rather than like trying to manage each little piece of Rome. They're just like, hey, this guy that we trust, you're in charge. As long as you keep the peace and give us our money, we're all good.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, to visualize it, it's not like Rome with this great empire around it and everybody can do what they want. It's rather, Rome is working actively through its officials to make sure that, like spokes in a wheel, right? Everybody is looking to Rome for their advancement, their protection, their prosperity, and in rivalry with each other. And this is part of what happens at this time is the development of the imperial cult. That is the cult of the emperor, worshiping the emperor. In Rome, emperors are not worshipped. That's crazy talk in Rome. That's, they are human beings, and they're not to be seen as divine characters, except they may claim a divine ancestry, but that's kind of pro forma It's not like they're worshipped in Rome. But in the East, where people were used to worshiping like Alexander the Great and his successors and treating them as the embodiment of gods, right? Even that name, Alexander or Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, right, is a revelation of God. That was the idea. So in the East, people were quick to say, hey, can we build you a temple to worship you? And some Roman emperors, like Tiberius, said, no, that's kind of gauche. I'm not a god. Don't do that. But others said, yeah, okay, why not? If it'll keep you happy. But the way that they managed it was they made it then a source of rivalry, right? So which temple would become like the big one, and which high priest had the most status? So this just became another source of useful rivalry among cities. So anyhow, and in Judea, of course, there was no imperial cult because the Jews were exempted by Augustus. They didn't have to worship him. He didn't care one way or another anyway. What he cared about was that they were loyal to him, and they offered in the Jerusalem temple, they offered sacrifices for, not to, but for the well-being of the emperor. And he said, that's perfectly fine. And that's what Herod arranged. But so Herod was a shrewd guy. In his territories, he created temples to the emperor, like a temple to Augustus in Caesarea or in Sebaste. But in Jerusalem, he knew that the laws didn't allow it, so he did something different there. He was, I'll come back to that in a second. So if I can visualize it this way, let's call it Plan A. The Romans never called it this, right? As I said, they didn't have this all worked out in some kind of big formula. But we can see from their practice that what they preferred was what I'm calling Plan A for this region of Syria. Namely, you have this old guy, senatorial, senior senator, often in his 60s or even older, up in Rome in Antioch. And he's got to be a very high-ranking senator. He's been a consul before, like he's an ex-consul. So he's the highest possible status. And he has 4 legions under his command, which he keeps near the Euphrates River somewhere. Or in the case of the 12th Legion, Fulminata, he keeps it a little bit to the south in basically in Lebanon today. But the others he keeps near the frontier because that's the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And their big potential enemy is the Parthian Empire to the east, right? That's where they never really managed to make much headway. And so they want to secure this area with a deterrent force, which is the 4 legions based in northern Syria. But that's a long way from, especially, in the old days, there's no automobiles or anything, trains. So it's a long way. It's like a 3-week march from Antioch down to the Jerusalem area. And, so that's a huge investment of time if you're ever going to go down and visit. So what they prefer to do is leave southern Syria under one guy who will dominate the whole thing. And that's King Herod. And so they developed this idea that Jerusalem, which used to dominate the area under the Hasmoneans, is still a useful area, right? They're used to governing. So we can still keep one of them in power. But we want a different kind of guy, not like the Hasmoneans who forced everybody to follow Judean laws. So here's, if you visit Jerusalem, the Israel Museum, you'll see this mock-up of first century Jerusalem with the temple, the upper city for the wealthy people, and with the red roofs there, and so on, like that. This is a quick impression of what Jerusalem probably looked like, the temple in the first century. But what the Romans liked about Herod was he had a balancing plan, right? So he would be very much the Judean king. He was the one who renovated the temple completely to make it look like that. If you visit the so-called Temple Mount today, the Haram al-Sharif, also called today, that platform on which the Dome of the Rock sits and the Aqsa Mosque, these are all sitting on the base that King Herod built, right? And the area around there that's been heavily excavated, that's all Herod's doing. He also built, however, a new port city on the coast that was not part of these old cities that were antagonistic to Jerusalem. Right? He built a new city. Well, it was a village called Stratos Tower, but he rebuilt it. It was just like a fishing village, but he rebuilt it into this major city with using hydraulic concrete to build a man-made harbor and so on, honoring Augustus. So it's called Caesarea, right? Caesar City. And he built there a center of imperial cult to make clear that it was loyal to Rome. And he regionally behaves as a very generous and powerful Hellenistic king. So he's not saying, hey, I'm a client of Rome, I'm a puppet of Rome. No, he's acting as a very powerful, swaggering kind of guy. And he uses his own funds to give money to all the coastal cities, not for Jewish stuff. He never asked them to become Jewish, right? Quite the contrary. He says, look, I respect your cultures, your traditions, your laws. He gives them money for their, gymnasia. These are these training facilities for teenage citizens where they're Greco-Roman, they're pagan places. They worship their gods with, colonnades, bath complexes, all the Greco-Roman stuff, including altars and temples. And he has a multi-ethnic army. Yeah, apparently somewhere around 10,000 Judeans, but also lots of Samaritans, Idumeans, Iturians from the north, Germans and Gauls, maybe an army of 18,000 or so. And he's very warm, particularly toward that ancient enemy of Samaria. I think I forgot to mention that John Hyrcanus had actually destroyed the temple of the Samaritans. And this became a really big sore spot in the ongoing hatred between the two people. So Herod, he rebuilds the city of Samaria, calling it now, again, Augustus city, using the Greek term, Sebaste, as their capital. He settles his own veteran army there. He marries one Samaritan. He takes 10 wives over his lifetime, but one of them is a Samaritan, and one of them he marries in Samaria. So he has a soft spot for Samaria, and he fully integrates it into his governing kind of vision, concept. So he's very different. This is the point. The Romans like him because he's very different from the Hasmoneans. He's not, imposing Jewish law or rule.
As you're describing him, it's not surprising to me that the Romans like him, because he sounds like the Romans sound when they're dealing with Judea.
Yeah.
He's basically doing the same thing, just on a smaller scale.
Yeah, exactly. They're outsourcing Roman stuff to Herod, right? You go and do likewise. Go and do what we do, and show this enlightened rule. But still, in spite of that, of course, no matter how nice people are, rulers, if they are your rulers, they're still your rulers, right? So these cities that were very proud cities still rejected Herod's rule. In Jerusalem itself, as we've already discussed, the priestly elite and the more kind of, I don't want to use the term religious because it's a tricky term for the ancient world, but the more pious, the more committed to the purest ways, of the Jews, the ancient ways of the law, the Torah, they were suspicious of this guy, even though he was pretty scrupulous about being Jewish when he's in Jerusalem. They still were nervous, like, why is he giving so much money to all these foreign cities and their gods and temples? And we're not sure about this guy and his cultural inclination. So he would hold games in Caesarea that were pagan games. They were, honoring Greco-Roman gods and in their entertainment facilities. So even though he kept Jerusalem as a very Jewish city and respected Jewish law, they were nervous about him. They didn't like him to a large extent. And there were some conspiracies against him. He started to send out spies, execute his enemies. It was a tough situation internally. Second, many of the Greek polis and Gadara, whom we mentioned as rebuilt right after Pompey, they really chafed under Jerusalem's rule. And they kept sending delegations to Augustus or his lieutenant, Marcus Agrippa, to complain about, can we please be removed from Jerusalem's rule? I mean, you did it already under Pompey, and now we're back there again. Now we're under this other guy, Herod. Yeah, okay, he's not like the Hasmoneans were, but still, it's a foreign rule. So Gadara is a very proud city with its own coinage, its own gods, its own, whole calendar way of doing things. And they simply don't want to be under Herod's rule. So when Herod dies, and this isn't really in Josephus, but it is recorded by a fellow named Nicholas of Damascus, who was Herod's aide. So he's from Damascus. He's not Jewish. But he records how when Herod died, these massive revolts broke out. All the people who had been under his thumb while he ruled, they wanted their autonomy back, and they sent delegations to Rome as well. Not only that, but the Idumeans, even while Herod lived, his brother-in-law, who was Idumean, and Herod was Idumean, right, by ancestry, he tried to secede from Jerusalem's rule and to reinstate the worship of Kos, Apollo, and the old Idumean customs. Yeah, that's why I said before that Idumea is kind of is a complex situation. They didn't just say, okay, we love everything Judean and we're going to worship in Jerusalem. There was a lot of ambivalence about this, of course, right? With your ancestral customs, that's how it would be. So we already saw that Augustus divided up things, but when that didn't work out, and when Archelaus was removed from Judea, the Romans had to go to Plan B. And Plan B was to say, well, okay, those elites from Jerusalem who asked us, right, to just become a normal city, that Jerusalem just become another city in Syria, in the province of Syria, subject to that legate way up in Antioch. Well, let's try that. But the problem remains that it's very far away, the south, from Antioch. So Plan B was, okay, we'll use a Herodian royal where one is available, but if one isn't available, we're going to put a lower level governor into the coastal town of Caesarea, which isn't one of these ancient towns with hostilities toward Jerusalem, which Herod himself built, and we'll put a man in there, right? So what that means is the administrative center of the south moves from Jerusalem to Caesarea under this, what's called a prefect. He holds equestrian status, so he's not a senator. He's a much lower level guy, but he's still a member of the Roman elite in the larger sense. And, Pontius Pilate is the longest serving of these guys. He's the most famous of them, right? But there was a series of them from 6 CE onward to 66, 67. There was one of these guys was installed in Caesarea. And he doesn't have legions at his disposal, right? Because he's not elevated enough to command legions. Only a senator can command legions. And this guy commands auxiliary forces, and the auxiliary forces are locally recruited. They're not Roman citizens. Locally recruited kind of police forces at a much lower pay scale, lower level of training, lower level of equipment, but they're in the Roman system as auxiliary, right? Auxiliary meaning helping forces to support the legions where the legions can't be. They're locally recruited with the promise that if they complete their 20 years, 25 years, whatever the career profile is at the time, if they do their whole service, right, not a 4-year tour, or even I guess it's more like putting in your 20, right? You can retire and become a Roman citizen. Right? So that's the promise. If you survive, and they're not likely to go to war, so they're probably going to survive if they don't get sick or fall on a nail or something. They're probably going to survive, and then they will have Roman citizenship, and then their children will be eligible to join the legions, right? So it's part of this integration, this very shrewd integration of the local populations. But
giving them like skin in the game
yeah,
for Rome.
Yeah, exactly. But who is going to sign up for this? Well, remember that Herod's army had a big Jewish contingent, right? And Samaritans and Iturians from the north and Idumeans from the south. So it was really a cosmopolitan force. But when the power center shifts to Caesarea, which is a Greco-Roman town, right, with a temple to Augustus, it's not a Jewish town. It goes by Greco-Roman customs and calendar and rules and culture. The Jews drop out because obviously they don't want to be living in a hostile area that where their laws don't prevail, right? Like Sabbath observance, not eating pork, the dietary laws, the Jewish calendar. It's all very inconvenient to be under foreign commanders if you can't follow your ancestral laws. So the Jews drop out when the power shift moves to Caesarea. Who forms the basis of the auxiliary? The Samaritans. Right, they're quite happy to stay in the game because for them it's a good deal, and they've always been traditionally the kind of military base. Remember that Herod settled his veterans in Sebaste in Samaria, right? So now Judea is back to this situation that we looked at before, not ruling the whole area anymore as under Herod, but with all of these potentially hostile and embittered regional neighbors because Jerusalem has governed them. And again, I emphasize that the Romans did not say, okay, we no longer have a Herodian royal, so let's go with somebody from Gerasa. Let's go with somebody from Joppa. Let's go with somebody from Ascalon. No, the Romans, worked on a basis of people they trusted, right? It was all a personal thing for them. They had to know the people, and they trusted first Antipater. He did a great job. Then they got to know his sons. Herod proved himself. He was in power. Okay. From then on, Herod's sons grow up in Rome, and his grandsons and his great-grandsons, they all grow up in Rome now, and they all become ever tighter with the Roman court, the Roman, leadership. So they're not going to go with anybody else. It's either a Jew governing from Jerusalem or nobody. And we'll put our own guy in on the coast to protect the Jews, right? And this is a big part of the equation. The Romans understand that with all these local rivalries now, which they are encouraging to an extent, they don't want it to get out of hand. And they know that the natural instinct will be for people to attack the Jews because they have been the dominant player in the region. And everyone else has been under Jerusalem's rule. So naturally, there will be animosities. But to keep a lid on all of these tensions, they're now going to use their own man based in Caesarea and give him an auxiliary force. It's going to be Samaritan, so he has to keep tight control over these guys and make sure they obey his commands and not let them just run amok, right? Because then it's going to be dangerous. So here are a few shots around Caesarea. That's a later aqueduct, but this is a first century a mansion, beautiful view by the sea. Here's where this is the kind of pool of the governor's residence that you can still see there. So now here I need to challenge what many people think, and it goes back to that map business that basically Judea was a Roman province that sort of looked like modern Israel, Palestine. We can see why people got that view, because Josephus is to blame for it. In his Judean War, he says that the territory of Archelaus had been marked off for a province, and Coponius, a procurator from the equestrian order, was sent, and he was given power up to capital punishment. So the idea was, according to Josephus' War, Coponius was sent as governor of a new province separate from Syria, right? You'll still see that as a kind of textbook view often. And it seemed to get confirmation from an inscription that was found in 1960 in Caesarea, which happened to be related to Pontius Pilate. It's got, if you can see the second line down there, can you see Eius Pilatus, right? So we know that the guy's name was Pontius Pilatus, right? And it says something about a Tiberiaeum. So the inscription is somehow relating to a facility or a structure called a Tiberiaeum. And then you can just make out a little bit that it was built. But what it says about Pilate on the third line down, which is barely legible, is that he was the praefectus, so the ectus part, and the Judaei part, prefect of Judea. Right? So something says something like, that's in the nominative case, so he built or rebuilt or something this Tiberiaeum, and just before Tiberiaeum you have an S. So what was that? So maybe he built the Tiberiaeum for somebody. Well, a scholar named Alfuldi has convincingly reconstructed, he's a specialist in inscriptions, he reconstructed it to the satisfaction of many people, not everybody, to say that Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, restored the Tiberium, nautis, the first word for the sailors. And this, in that case, it would be a kind of a lighthouse tower at the entry to the harbor, because Josephus mentions that there was a tower there for Tiberius' late brother named Drusus, and the tower was called the Druseum. Well, then it would stand to reason that if there was a Tiberiaeum, that would be a matching tower to Tiberius. So anyway, this was taken to be proof for a long time that Judea was a province, and this guy sent to Caesarea was the governor of this province. And the reason I'm going into this, and I'll move along quickly now, but the reason I'm going into it is it feeds the idea that Judea was a province in revolt, right, against Rome. That Rome had oppressed this province for so long, and then suddenly it turned around, like some of the Western provinces, like the Batavians, right, or the Britons, the British under Boudica, right? The Boudica revolt of 60 was like, a province revolting against Roman rule. The Gallic revolt, things like that. But there was no province. That's what I'm trying to say here. Why not? Well, scholars have increasingly come to see this from the 1970s onward, having to rethink all the evidence together. And it's now pretty clear that Judea didn't ever become a province until the Flavians made it a province so that they could celebrate their triumph and say, look, we created a new province for the Roman Empire. How do we know that? Well, first of all, its senators normally command provinces. The only real exception to this was Egypt, which had an equestrian governor, but that was a situation unique to Egypt, which we don't have time to get into. All ancient writers who talk about Judea don't describe it as a province. Even those who describe, like Strabo and Cassius Dio, describe the Roman provincial system, and they describe the different types. They never call Judea a province. Judea is, in their descriptions, the territory of the city of Jerusalem. Just like I mentioned before, it's not a province. And the crucial thing is that when Josephus writes his later account, the Antiquities, he says very, very clearly that in 6 CE, Judea was annexed to the province of Syria. And this is why when Quirinius, who is the new legate sent to the province of Syria, the whole thing, the senatorial legate, right, Publius Quirinius, that's why he takes the census. That, the famous census from the Gospel of Luke under Quirinius. Well, if Judea had been a separate province, he wouldn't have done that. It's the reason that he shows up and takes a census is because it's now part of his province. And Josephus says this very clearly. He repeats it, actually, and it makes sense. So Coponius doesn't come as the governor of a separate province. He comes with Quirinius as his assistant in charge of the lower part of the province of Syria. And the biggest consideration here is that, okay, you say War tells one story, Antiquities tells another story. Which one are you going to believe? Well, War's picture can be understood in terms of Antiquities' picture, but the reverse is not true. So that is to say, War itself later, for example, War always describes towns in the south that are not Jewish as in Syria, all the way down to Rafah, all the way down to, it's in the news today very much, Rafah, right on the border of Egypt, Rafia in ancient language. It's called the beginning of Syria in these texts. I mentioned that all these other geographers describe the area as Syria, and the Flavians held the triumph for the new province of Judea. So everything fits if the Judea is part of Syria. And when Josephus was writing War, he just misstated, because the Greek term for province, eparchia, can have different senses, right? Even a royal territory is sometimes called a province. So he was apparently speaking loosely, and he misled generations of people into thinking that Judea was a province. Actually, it is a territory, an ethnic zone under the province of Syria. I'm coming to the end soon, because now we get to the question of the conflicts. Well, this has to do with that auxiliary army in Caesarea, and that's what I want to suggest to you is the big problem here. I mentioned that Herod's army was multi-ethnic, had all these people, but the ethnic units were kept separate under Roman officers who were seconded, from the legions to help out, just the same way that British, American, Western officers often go to train foreign armies today. So when Archelaus was removed, you have the beginning of this auxiliary force. So I've said all that. Now, here's an example. Here's a text that is widely overlooked, but I would like to focus on it. And it comes only in Antiquities 19. And here's the problem. When Agrippa the First is put in power again, I didn't mention this yet, but in 41 CE, I did mention that Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, was very grateful that Agrippa helped him become emperor, right? So he makes him king in Judea. He gives him the kingdom of his grandfather, Herod, back again, basically. And so he's only like 50 years old. I say only, I'm older than that. So it sounds
50's
young.
50's not that old.
No, okay, we can agree. 50's not so old, right? So he becomes king, and he's looking forward to so the Romans are reinstalling a Jewish kingship from Jerusalem under Agrippa, right? And they figure he's going to be king for a very long time, and he has a successor, whom we know as Agrippa II, who's a teenager. He's like 16 at this time. And by the time, Agrippa I dies or abdicates, his son will be ready to take over. And so this shows again that the Romans prefer to have the whole place governed by a Jewish king from Jerusalem. So they put it under Agrippa I. Now this means that that army goes back to Jerusalem under Jewish command and control, under Jewish law. So you have Jews back in the army again. But what happens to Agrippa I? Well, it's also a story in the New Testament, right? In Acts chapter 12, I think, that he up and dies, shocks everybody just after like 3 years. So he's put in power in 41, and then in 44, there's a story in both Josephus and Acts about how he accepts praise as if he's a god, because he holds a big meeting in a theater, and the sun reflects off his shiny clothes, and he radiates And the people in the audience start to say, "Oh, you're a god," and he doesn't say, "No, I'm not. Don't worship me." So, according to both stories, because he accepts worship, God strikes him down. Well, he also had some kind of disease, so let the medical people figure that one out. But anyway, for whatever reason, he dies. And nobody was expecting this. And his son now is 16. He's too young, right, to take over. So what happens? Well, it means that the power is going to shift back to Caesarea again. And here's a really fascinating story that Josephus relates. He says, when it became known that Agrippa had departed this life, the Caesareans and Sebastines, right, that's where the recruiting ground for the auxiliary force, forgetting his kindness, took a position of extreme hostility. They hurled slanders at the deceased that would be unseemly to relate. Those of them who were serving in the military at the time, and there were many, went off to his house and seized the statues of the king's daughters, who were teenage girls. So at his house, he's got statues of his daughters. They brought these to the brothels, set them up on the roofs, and proceeded to indulge their desires in every possible manner, doing things too shameful. He said enough that we kind of have the idea of what these shameful things were. They turned public spaces into dining rooms and held feasts for everyone. So street parties, right, pouring like cologne over themselves and pouring out libations to the god Charon, who is the god who takes the dead across the river Styx, right, into Hades. So they're pouring toast to Charon, saying, take him away. Just totally celebrating.
I'm getting the impression they didn't like Agrippa very much.
Yeah. Well, and you can see why, right? Because they were brought back from Caesarea, where they're at home in their barracks. They're totally integrated into the city. They're worshiping their gods. They're following their calendar, customs, diet. Now they are under the command of a Jewish king. Can't do that anymore in Jerusalem. So now they are celebrating like crazy, right? Saying we're free. They didn't expect it. They thought they'd be under his thumb for decades to come. They and their successors would be under him and his son, under a Jewish king, under Jerusalem. So they celebrate like crazy. And Caesar, that is Claudius at this time, when he hears how the Sebastines and Caesareans had insulted his friend, was furious. He had given clear instructions to the next governor, so he's got to reinstate Plan B, right? So he's got to set things back up in Caesarea again. So the guy he sends out now as the new equestrian governor is Cuspius Fadus, and he tells him to read the riot act to these guys for their insults to the man who had died and their impertinence toward his daughters. And he gives him orders to transfer to the Black Sea these auxiliary units. There's a cavalry wing of 500 and 5 cohorts of 500 guys. Send them all to do their military service up there, far, far away from Judea. And ask the legate in Syria for an equivalent number of soldiers, about 2/3 of a legion. Can you send us legionaries, Roman citizen soldiers, to take their place? Why? Because they won't be embroiled in these ancient antagonisms, right, between the Samaritans and the Judeans. Or Roman citizens, they don't care. They're all the same. Foreigners are all the same to them. So bring in some legionaries to take their place, kick these guys out, and we'll show them. Claudius says, I'll show them that they can't mess around with my friends like that. The soldiers did not transfer, however, Josephus says. They sent emissaries, delegations to Rome and placated Claudius and said, we're really, really sorry. We won't do it again. Didn't mean to. We had a bad day. We got overexcited. Please let us stay, pretty please, with sugar on top. And they managed to stay in Judea. And this is what's really interesting and is widely neglected. Josephus says these very men proved to be a source of the greatest disasters for the Judeans in the coming times. having sown the seeds of the war under Florus. Now, Florus is Gessius Florus. He will be the equestrian governor who is present when the war breaks out. And this is really important. So what Josephus is saying is that the aggravations that later occurred, that really kicked off the revolt, occurred under Florus with these guys carrying the weapons. That is why, he adds, when Vespasian came to power, as we will shortly relate, and he never does get around to relating it, he expelled them from the province. So Vespasian, he's saying, understood the causes of the revolt, and that it wasn't about the Judeans having a problem with Rome. It was this aggravating factor of the auxiliary force. And that's why, he says, he got rid of them and put in a legionary army and made Judea into a province under a senator with a legion and without these, these traditional auxiliary soldiers. Now, I thought I could illustrate. This is the last thing before I close. Is all right, guys, if I illustrate how this works? So, just 7 years after what we just read, we have a kind of vivid window into life on the ground there, with a series of 3 little vignettes that Josephus discusses in the years 51 to 52, right? So now there's a new governor that is this lower level equestrian. By the way, I mentioned there was Cuspius Fadus, right? It was the first one. And he was sent to really read the riot act to these auxiliary soldiers, tell them to smarten up and do what they're told. The next guy from 46 to 48 is a Judean, right? Claudius sends out a Judean from a very elite Jewish family from Alexandria named Tiberius Julius Alexander. He sends him to be governor, right? Then after him will come after Cumanus. So Cumanus is the next one. And then that we're going to talk about right now. And then after him comes Felix. And Felix will marry a Herodian woman, right? So Felix will marry a Herodian woman named Drusilla, a sister of Agrippa II. So that again shows, where the lines of power are. But here, under Cumanus is interesting because he's kind of an exception, and he illustrates the dangers that are coming in the next decade when war breaks out. So that's why these 3 little episodes are fascinating. So in the first one, Josephus says that there's a Passover celebration in Jerusalem. And that's when the city swells to 3, 4, maybe 10 times its normal population. It's like the Hajj pilgrimage, right, in Mecca a little bit. Like Jews from all over the world, if they're able to, they travel to Jerusalem for Passover. And the wealthier ones from Alexandria and from other places will come to Jerusalem. So the city really expands, and it's packed in the temple area with people. And that's why the auxiliary force comes in, especially, they always keep a rotating garrison in Jerusalem. But at this point, they increase their numbers, and they stay in the fortress Antonia, which is adjoining the temple. We won't go back to the slide, but there's a slide back there that showed you the temple layout and the fortress Antonia on the corner of it. That's where the auxiliary army stays, and they patrol the area by walking around the tops of the colonnade. So there's colonnade all the way, like columns, portico, all the way, or porch, all the way around the perimeter of the temple. And the auxiliary soldiers, who are now Samaritans and Caesareans, they stroll around with their armor and spears and stuff around the top, looking down on the crowds below. As you can imagine, this creates like tension every single time. So he says that on this occasion in 51 CE at Passover, an auxiliary soldier, taking advantage of his position, lifted up his cloak, exposed like he mooned the crowd below, and let out this gigantic noise with a gesture to accompany it. just to insult everybody, because he knew they couldn't touch him, right? He's up on top of the colonnade. And I think you can actually imagine this happening in any kind of such situation today, right? Where there's one group of soldiers over another. You guys know a lot more about soldiering than I do, but
Jared and I were both soldiers, and this is exactly the kind of thing a soldier would do.
right. Okay, thanks. I would imagine that, right? Yeah, well, especially when you've got a foreign population that you don't really respect all that much, right? Under your control. So he made this gesture, and of course, the population below starts picking up whatever they can find nearby, little stones or whatever, and starts throwing them up at the soldiers. And then all the soldiers file out from the Fortress Antonia to come to their buddy's aid, of course. That I think also happens. So then it's terrifying because you've got the whole garrison out there now with, spears and arrows and whatever they've got. And so the Judeans now below, many of them didn't want to fight to begin with, just start scrambling for the exits. And of course, it's a very crowded area. Josephus says that 30,000 die in this stampede. That's he often inflates his numbers by a factor of 10 or 100 sometimes. But even if it were 300 died, it would be, terrible. And that's what happens. In that episode, Josephus says the governor Cumanus was present. And he watched the whole thing, and he was terrified. He was helpless and didn't know what to do. But he came out of it alive. It was just a tragedy that so many Jews died who were celebrating the Passover. The next episode, however, so Josephus tells these as a building, tensions building, but the tensions are not with Rome. The tensions are with the auxiliary soldiers, right? So now the second episode is that out in the countryside, near that town of Bet Horon that I mentioned before, which links the lowlands from the highlands of where Judea is, some Judean bandits rob an imperial slave named Stephanos, and the auxiliary soldiers under Cumanus are told to round up the ordinary residents and bring them in for questioning. And again, one of the soldiers who's feeling his oats comes across a copy of a Torah scroll, which is in Hebrew, right? And he sees a strange language, and he takes the liberty to rip it up and throw it on the fire. And of course, there's a massive, you can imagine, like the burning of the Quran today, it would be, I think, the same kind of effect. The population goes crazy and with outrage and complains to Cumanus. And the interesting thing here is that Cumanus orders his soldier to be drawn out, paraded before the Judeans, and then visibly, publicly executed to show. So here's a Roman governor, sub-governor, right, saying, okay, we got to keep a lid on all this stuff. So he deliberately has his own soldier who was offending in this matter publicly tortured and executed. All right. Third episode is the most complex and interesting one. And this is a Jew who's in Galilee who goes on the next Passover of 52. He is going to travel through Samaria. Now, according to Josephus, the Gospels, and implied in Tacitus, that's a dangerous thing for everybody. So usually pilgrims from Galilee who wanted to go to Jerusalem, like Jesus, right, in his last days, he didn't go through Samaria. Why? Because the tensions are too serious and it's dangerous. So they usually would go by the Jordan Valley route. So it was much longer, but they would travel out east, go down along the Jordan Valley, come back up through at Jericho, right, come back up through the hills to Jerusalem, because that was a circuit around Samaria. It took longer, maybe 6-7 days rather than 3 days through Samaria, but it was safer. This pilgrim decides to go through Samaria and he's murdered. Right, he gets to just the town of Jenin, which is right on the northern border of Samaria, and he's already murdered. The Jewish leaders are outraged, of course, and they go to the governor, Cumanus, and say, please, come on, check this out. Punish the guy, punish whoever did it. Cumanus says he's too busy and he can't go up to Samaria to inquire into this murder. Murders happen. And anyway, it's Passover time and he's got to go to Jerusalem with, that's a much bigger situation, right? Tens of thousands of people, and there could be serious problems there. So he's got to be in Jerusalem. He says, I'm too busy to investigate this. But when word of the murder, especially of a pilgrim headed to Jerusalem for Passover, gets out, the Jews of Jerusalem, who are now, massed in large numbers, you can imagine, right? The crowd just gets really worked up with anger, outrage. And what they do is they head to the closest Samaritan town, which is not Jenin. It's like on the opposite end, the southeast part, in Akrabatene, and they start to attack Samaritan villages nearby and burn them. Now, Cumanus says, okay, I've got to act. But how does he act? Well, he's only got an auxiliary force who are Samaritan, right? So he takes a cavalry wing, because that's like a rapid reaction force, right, to get there, quite faster than the infantry. So he takes them to calm the situation and punish the Jews who I mentioned before, right? The Romans will not allow, they're fine for the tensions to build, but they will not allow people to start fighting each other. They should go to Rome. And that's what the Jews tried to do, right? They went to Cumanus and said, you've got to sort this out. He said, I'm too busy. So they were outraged and took it upon themselves. Now, the Samaritans, and this is where it gets really interesting, this guy who, the current legate, the senatorial guy who's way up north, he happens to be visiting Tyre on the coast of Lebanon, which is fairly close now to Judea. So the Samaritans send a delegation to complain to him, because he's the top guy with the legions, right? And says, look, the Judeans are attacking us here. We didn't do anything, and they're attacking us. You've got to intervene. And the Judeans send a delegation to him. Of course, they have to. And they blame the Samaritans. They say, well, they murdered our guy. And Cumanus is not doing what he's supposed to do. So Quadratus is drawn now into the situation, and he goes to Caesarea himself. He can go anywhere he wants. It's his province. He kills the Judeans that Cumanus he executes the Judeans that Cumanus is holding responsible because they violated the laws and they went and attacked Samaritans. And then he goes on to the town of Lud, or Lydda, which is where the airport, Ben Gurion Airport is today, Lud Airport. And he kills, again, tries and executes 18 of Judeans who were involved in this. But then he realizes that this is a serious situation, even for him as a legate. So he sends their delegations from both parties, Samaritans and Judeans, to Rome. When they get to Rome, the Emperor Claudius has a hearing, and he is influenced by Agrippa II, and he executes 3 of the Samaritans right on the spot, right on the spot of 3 delegates. He just says, right, you guys are building a frivolous case. You're the ones who murdered this guy, and I'm sentencing you to death. And he banishes his own equestrian governor, right? Sends him off to exile. And he sends the Roman tribune, the officer. I said before that the auxiliary force was officered by Romans usually. And so the tribune, the highest officer in charge, Keller, he sends him back to Jerusalem to be tortured and beheaded by the Judeans. But this is incredible, right? So what am I trying to say? Look at the dynamics involved here, right? That it's very complicated, but it's certainly not the case that the Romans are oppressing the Jews, right?
So the picture that I'm getting is basically that the power in this region went back and forth between Jews and non-Jews. Like the Jews are in charge, then the Romans are in charge. It's kind of more equitable. And whenever the Jews are in charge, they're happy. Whenever the Jews are not in charge, everyone else is happy, and that's leading to this conflict. And the Romans are trying to manage it, but like really nobody's happy with
Right.
however the Romans do it. But the
Right.
Romans, like you're saying, are not uniquely like persecuting the Jews.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do things that the Jews don't like. Sometimes they protect the Jews against the others. Sometimes they do so even over and against their own Roman rulers, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Exactly. And their preference is, and the underlying thread, the red thread that runs through this is that the Herodian royal family, the Jerusalem royal family, continues to have considerable influence and pull in Rome. But what Cumanus illustrates, I think, is also a very human and predictable potential problem, which is that the Roman governor there will be tempted always to go native, right? I mean, the army that he commands is Sumerian. And again, you guys have the military experience, but my understanding would be that, to be an effective commander, you need the trust of your soldiers, right? I mean, you need their respect. So anyone in that position would always be tempted. There would be a powerful inclination, I would think. I don't know what you think about this, but I would think to adopt their customs, to kind of say, I'm one of you, to celebrate with them or whatever. So the checks and balances that Rome put in at the upper level would be needed to counteract this inevitable kind of alignment, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also it would be not completely tie the hands of the Roman in charge, but he would be a little bit restricted because the people he would be using to enforce his will are people who are antagonistic to the Jewish people. And
Yeah.
so it would be difficult for him to say, hey, my Sumerian soldiers, let's go punish Samaria. That's, you could imagine he might be reluctant to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that raises a very interesting point. When Josephus retells these three stories, the same triplet, he always does this. And when he writes the Antiquities later, he retells many of the stories of the war. And he's pretty free as an author he forgets details or he just retells them in a different way. So the basic stories are the same. But, well, for one thing, he just makes the number killed in the first episode 20,000 instead of 30,000. So, like I said, it might have been 300 or 200 or 50.
What's 10,000 people between friends,
between
right?
friends, right. And he doesn't have the burning of the Torah scroll. It's just now this soldier jeers at it, sort of makes fun of it. But still, the Jews revolt. And now he adds the detail that Cumanus beheaded the soldier with an axe, which is entirely plausible for a Roman citizen. And then he changes the third story to say it wasn't one pilgrim. He said a bunch of people were killed. A bunch of pilgrims were murdered. And he adds the very important, if it were true, detail that Cumanus was actually bribed by the Sumerians not to inquire. Now, we must be highly suspicious of this because bribery is a very easy thing to allege. And very hard to know about whether it really happened. People always explain things that they don't understand. How could someone have done that? Must have been bribed. So we can probably discount that, but that's what he says. And it changes the color of the story, right? Because Cumanus is now really shown to be in bed with the Sumerians. And he says that Cumanus not only takes a cavalry wing out to check the situation. He takes his entire force, all the infantry cohorts, and he arms the Sumerian populace, all right, as well. That's what he claims in Antiquities. Now, that could all be nonsense. He might have just made it up on the spur of the moment. But it's interesting that he says it, and it does give a different complexion to the story. Moreover, when Quadratus comes south in the new story, he's much more even-handed right from the get-go. So he already suspects the Samaritans are guilty, and instead of going to Caesarea in this new account, he goes to Samaria, listens to the Samaritans, and decides they're the guilty ones because they allowed the murders of these pilgrims from Galilee. So he crucifies Samaritans and Judeans in this account. And finally, when Josephus now recounts the episode in Rome, he says that Agrippa, it wasn't just Agrippa II, the Herodian royal, who did this on his own, but he had influence with Claudius' wife, who was famously able to manipulate Claudius. So he adjusts the story this way and has Claudius execute all the Samaritan emissaries and orders Keller, the tribune, tortured and executed. So a little adjustments. I don't know what to make of them. Josephus freely retells his stories, so I wouldn't put too much stock in it. But I just thought people should know that he does tell things a little bit differently. But it's illuminating of the complex dynamics, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. And I think that in very human terms, we can understand the potential, whether it happened exactly this way or that way or the other way. In general terms, we can understand the dynamics at play because we still recognize the same human factors. I confess that I'm really suspicious of these generic categories of imperialism, colonialism, all the isms that we tend to impose on. Well, imperialists act this way, right? They oppress those under them. They just want them for revenue or whatever. I think that whenever you probe behind, whether it's with the British Empire or the French Empire or anybody else, there's always much more complexity involved, right? That's really what I'm trying to say. So to summarize, and now I am at the end of all this, here's how it seems to me we should look at this thing, that the local conflict was a root conflict. It's there on the ground between neighbors. It's not abstract, right? It's not like Jews against the idea of Rome or something like that. It's in your face. It's what happens in real life, that these people are living next to each other. These people have dominated these people for a very long time. These people used to be powerful. They had their power, undercut, taken away from them by these people who destroyed their temple, and they hate them and they hate them. And so that's on the ground. But then the aristocracies of all groups tend to restrain these groups, right? These hostilities. And they usually, just because it's in their interest as landholders and leaders, right? They tend to put a brake on the playing out violently of these hostilities. Then, under the Roman system, well, the Romans have a backstop for these hostilities, which is the prefect in Caesarea, in charge of a Roman officered auxiliary. So even though the auxiliary is necessarily composed of those who are willing to be in it, and the Judeans are not, so it is Samaritan, but it's officered by Romans. And so the Romans expect they can keep a lid on these hostilities, even as they prefer to have a monarch in Jerusalem. That's the very simplest solution to the whole problem. But alternative B is to use the auxiliary to protect and police Jerusalem. So you have this equestrian prefect in Caesarea with his Roman officers over the auxiliary. The problems are most likely to arise in this sphere right here, right? When the local tensions are allowed to burst out through the prefect, that equestrian governor, if he is not sufficiently, straightened out, if he's left too long in office, that's where the problems could be. Because that soldier-officer trust bond is going to incline him to absorb his men's outlook, I think. So that's where the old guy up north, the imperial legate who's in command of the Roman citizen army, the legions, that's where he steps in. And then as a final, so he's got the authority, like Quadratus in this case we just looked at, Quirinius earlier, lots of these guys, very senior guys, they're able to step in at any time and send the equestrian guy packing back to Rome to give an account of himself, right? So that's how the system is supposed to work. And the final check is the emperor in Rome and his own advisors, who include Judean Herodian royals. And so things work out all right until the reign of Claudius, who is firmly protective of Jews. Things work out all right for the Jews. Now, what happens at the very end? How do you explain the war? Well, very simply, we don't have time to get into this. I would argue that everything changes with Nero. Everything in this whole system, or this, it's not quite a system, but this whole tradition of checks and balances and personal relationships and dynamics involved, that all changes with Nero. I mentioned that Nero comes to power at 16. For the first 5 years, he just follows his mother's, lead, and he takes over advisors that she puts in place from Claudius's reign. So like people like Seneca, who is a philosopher who teaches the young guy, this is how you should rule. But then when he's 21, Nero decides that he's had enough of all this. He wants to be his own man. He has his mother killed. He gets rid of his advisors in various ways and says, to hell with all that. I'm me. I want to be me. And he's an odd duck. He's very artistic, or thinks he is. He will undertake a big artistic tour to Greece. He's very much a Hellenophile, Greek. He loves Greek culture, Greek cities. He spends lavishly. And so things start to go, the wheels start to come off everywhere in the empire from around the year 60, 61. That's when the British revolt under Boudica, because of his rule, he's calling in loans that they thought were gifts to them. He demands, and he has his men, underlings demand their money back. And so this in part leads to the Boudica revolt. He's got a terrible financial shortage, so he sends his equestrian officers out through the empire to raid temples throughout Italy, throughout Greece, and temples are supposed to be inviolate, right? They're places of safe deposit for money. The Jerusalem temple is one of the richest in the world because Jews only have one temple. Well, they have one in Egypt that's not really kosher, but there's one temple to which Jews from all over the world send annual donations. And it's known to be one of the wealthiest temples in the world. And Nero tells his men, especially Gessius Florus in 64, after the Great Fire of Rome, destroys much of the city, and Nero wants to build his massive palace, the Golden House. He sends his equestrians out to raid temples. That's what happens. Who's his muscle to raid the Jerusalem temple? The auxiliary army. Yahoo, right? It's okay. We get to beat these people up because
I'm sure they were so reluctant to take part in this.
Well, exactly, right? They're let off the leash now. Just go and take the money, and if anybody gives you any grief, kill them, beat them up. You've got my permission. And so these are the dynamics, I think. So my conclusions. Main one is there's no single Roman policy toward the Jews throughout this period. The scene in 50 to 52 is not like it was in the 20s or the 60s, right? On the one hand, there are enduring conditions on the ground of deep hostility, regional hostility. That remains. Jerusalem, Samaria, the coastal cities, Ascalon hates Jerusalem. The Decapolis cities, they hate Jerusalem. Idumea is in this complex love-hate relationship. On the other hand, there are noticeable Roman tendencies. There's no plan, but there are instincts and reflexes, right? They want peace, they want stable revenue, they want power, not a formal plan, but small footprint, layers of checks and balances, keep people on the boil, but don't let them fight, trust the local aristocracies, give them a stake. Informally, this all depended on the situation and the personalities of those in power. So under Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius Caligula, and Claudius, they mostly protected Judea, although Gaius Caligula was an aberration because he got angry once. He wanted his statue installed in the temple in Jerusalem. That caused a revolt, or a riot at least, or a passive resistance, but he was soon out of the picture because he was assassinated in Rome. So everything is basically under control until Nero comes in. The point about Nero is that he just throws everything into a cocked hat. The senator up in the north, who in this case now is Cestius Gallus from 65 onward, he's powerless because there's a senatorial conspiracy against Nero in Rome, and Nero no longer trusts senators at all. Whereas the previous emperors had leaned on them as the most respected, trusted governors, Nero's having them commit suicide. So some of them, like Corbulo, the Scriboni brothers from Germany, he has them, invites them to meet him and says, this would be a good time to, end your life, please, because you've become inconvenient for me. And he just executes lots of others that he accuses of conspiracy. So this is not a good time for the legate, the senatorial guy, to be acting against Nero's financial guy, Gessius Florus, who's told to collect money from the temple. He doesn't want to get in his way. So everything is screwed up now, and Nero is not listening to the Judean royals anymore. So in spite of their reputation, Vespasian and Titus, who actually conducted the Judean war, so in tradition, Titus is the one, he's held responsible for destroying the temple. But actually, they enacted Claudius's plan and reverted to, they were very much fans of Claudius. Vespasian had really prospered under Claudius's rule, and he was tightly connected with the Herodian Jerusalem elite in the east, like Agrippa II. So they did remove the troublesome auxiliary and the prefect when they came to power, and put in a senatorial province under a trusted governor with a legion, a citizen legion. So that's what I had to say, guys. Does that make very much sense, or do you have questions?
I think so. So like basically the picture everyone has of Roman rule is that the Jews were uniquely oppressed by these evil, horrible Romans that were looking over their shoulder at all times. And in fact, on the ground, the situation was there were local hostilities that the Romans were trying to manage, but not being in charge, going between being in charge and not being in charge, kind of antagonized the Jews, especially.
Yeah.
And then things were kind of simmering, but kept under control until Nero just through all the safety checks that had been keeping things under control, and then things erupted, but not because the Romans were particularly horrible, but because the Jews had grievances with their neighbors, and the Romans kind of were antagonizing that at some points in history.
Exactly so. The one thing that I want to stress is that I'm not suggesting, we always tend to interpret this stuff in moral terms, like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, right? Are the Romans good, are they bad? I'm not really saying anything about that at all. For me, I'm kind of a realist in international relations. This wasn't about Romans having sentimental attachments to Jerusalem or anything like that. It was really pure calculation, right? What's in their interests as a ruling power. So I want to stress that. I'm not saying the Romans were nice guys or otherwise. It's just what made sense to them.
I think what's important to highlight is we, as in laymen's usually, and just common folk, tend to simplify things. And so you hear Romans are in charge, there's conflicts, So the Romans are responsible, and then the temple was destroyed, and temple destroyed means, lots of things exploding, not literally exploding, but tensions like you implied. However, when we just spent the last couple hours going over this, and we probably barely scratched the surface as to all of the complexities that's going on, both politically, socially, you know, geographically, everything that's tied up into this. And so you really can't even break it down in 2 hours, let alone just a simple statement of like the Romans were in charge and things were bad for Judea. And what does even Judea mean when, So I really appreciate you taking the time to go through all that. I learned so much, and even things that I learned in my undergrad, I was like, wait a second, they didn't go into that. So it was really enlightening.
Thank you.
It-
Well, I hope that it's useful for everything we do, this kind of study, because what it shows is that we all rely on areas that we don't have the luxury to explore. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate. This is my thing. But there are many other areas of life, like the sciences, nuclear engineering, and whatever that I know nothing about. And we all rely on stories, simple stories, right? Like, okay, that's got that covered. I think I've got that. But of course, once you probe into the reality of any subject or any historical period, right? The Second World War, the Blitz of London. There's a simple version, right? The Blitz, spirit, courage, and all that. And then there's the reality that a historian will find once you start to look at diaries and newspapers and actual stuff. So yeah, I mean, for me, this is the thrill of history. History, I think, is the way. History is our hope, in my view, because it's something we can all do. Like, you guys come from different backgrounds from me, and anybody of goodwill can sit down and say, let's investigate everything and be open, to think about what. And we've all got our little stories, our little comforting stories about who the good guys were and the bad guys were. But if we can put those aside, even with the big conflicts today, say, yeah, that's how we know the big story. But let's explore. Can we talk? Can we look at the evidence? Can we say, how should this be interpreted? Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry if my enthusiasms are
no.
crowding up, but I really think that, quite seriously, history has a lot to offer, even as a kind of therapy, for our times.
So just a couple questions. Having seen, like, here's the cultural milieu and like all the kind of disabusing some of the preconceived notions people might have had about the sort of what Roman rule looked like. If you were just a typical Jewish peasant in Galilee or in the area of Jerusalem, what would Roman rule have looked like to you? Because like we talked earlier, how people like imagine there's like a Roman legionary with a shield and sword on every street corner. But it sounds like, in fact, probably people, if you're just a peasant, you might have gone your entire life and never seen a legionary.
Precisely. Yeah, there's no reason you would. And if you're in the area of the Sea of Galilee, right, the Kinneret Lake, for example, that's Agrippa's territory. Well, it depends at what time you're talking about. But in the 50s, that's Agrippa's territory. So Agrippa's got a small army of his own because he's a monarch. So he's got a little force left over from the generations of Herod's type of soldiers. But it's a small force. Yeah, you're not going to see legionaries. You're not going to see them in Jerusalem unless the legate from the north happens to be visiting, which he did sometimes at Passover. But it wasn't a force of intimidation then. He was there to strengthen his bonds with the local elite. So he would come with an escort, small escort, but that's it. So if you lived in Jerusalem, you might at a given Passover see some legionaries, and I guess they would be a big deal. Probably the kids come out on the street and take chocolate from them or something. I don't know what, but that's how it would be, I think.
I always find it fascinating to try to put myself in the minds, because I think sometimes people can like forget that these were just people, just like we're people, just living their lives.
Yeah.
Like putting myself in the mindset of like a Galilean peasant like Jesus. The Roman legions are something you probably heard about. they're always this like specter off in the distance, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and like something like you've just heard is very intimidating and dangerous and scary. And like then those same peasants who've heard of these people all the time, then Vespasian shows up with 60,000 of them. You know, I can imagine how shocking that might have been to them, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. And that's all they're there to do. I mean, is to show, I think one expression is sort of theater dominance or something like that, right? That's what they're there to do. And you don't want to see them because
Right.
what they're trained to do is to kill and to show force and to intimidate. That's what their whole makeup, the whole way they dress, you know, with the big crests on the top and be towering above everybody. That's what they're there to do, right? Is to terrify and to, you know, just dominate everything. And if that means burning some villages, which are mostly empty by the time they get there, anybody who could leave has left. That's what they do. So you don't want to see them unless they're in a parade or something, you know, under the command of somebody who keep them in check.
So we've been talking obviously because this is your specialty. We're talking about the area where Jesus lived and like the first century and all the things that led up to there. But I imagine very similar stories could be told about any other Roman province and life there. But did in terms of how the Romans ruled, say Gaul or uh, Spain or Hispania or whatever, did they were there what kind of differences did the Jews experience that other people might not have been afforded?
Yeah. Um, yeah, each place was very different. So the Western Empire is completely different in a way. I mean, first of all, they don't have the traditions of the Alexander's successors and all that stuff, the Greek traditions. And the way that they joined the empire was they came in earlier. So under Julius Caesar, the Gallic Wars, and they tended to become Romanized and Latinized, speaking Latin, very much earlier. And so they also rose up quickly in the Roman ranks and were given not only citizenship, but you have senators and emperors very soon coming from Spain and Gaul. But then, for that reason, they were not militarized any longer. So the Romans had two main kinds of provinces. Once Augustus came along, he divided the provinces between those of the people belonging to the Senate, and they were under a proconsul. And he did not command, usually, with one exception, North Africa, he didn't usually command legions. So they didn't see legionaries at all. They were just trusted to be collaborative. So their local city elites would collaborate with the governor, the proconsul, who was there on behalf of the Senate. So he was to have the powers of a consul, and he's really there as a senator, really emphasizing that. The others provinces were the armed provinces, and they had the legions in them. And their governor was also a senator, but he was there as the legate, the personal emissary, the legatus Augusti, so the personal emissary of the emperor, right? And he wore military garb and had a sword at his side, and he was a commander of all. So he was the senior commander. Each of the legions was commanded by a senator, but he needed only to be a praetor rank. So praetor is the step below consul. He had to have been a praetor already, but a senator, and he could command a legion. This was a big deal. They were chosen by the emperor, the commanders of the legions. I guess a little bit like generals today, right, in the army, chosen by the president. They're the top guys. And so, and the emperor needed to know he could trust these guys, right? Because they had military power at their disposal.
It often turned out that the person who had the loyalty to the armies suddenly found their way to being emperor.
Exactly. Yeah, and it had to do with money, right? Promising the army a donative of a huge amount of, like, 3 years' pay as a bonus, something like that. So yeah, so there's very much difference among the provinces and how they're governed, and the ones closest to Italy generally, so like Asia Minor, Asia, those areas, they didn't have legions. Greece They didn't have legions, and they didn't need them because they were so integrated with the Roman Empire. So it's really around the periphery in Britain on the one side, and North Africa, and Spain, in one part of Spain, and then on the east, the northeast, and so on the Rhine as well, you had 8 legions. So it's a big concentration of legions, because that's over the Rhine is where you have these German tribes that were never able to be assimilated into the empire, and on the Danube. So the Rhine, and then along the Danube, and then facing the Parthians. Yeah. So for those places that had legions, they all varied one place to another. So, for example, in Egypt, which had 2 legions, but under an equestrian governor, precisely because the emperor didn't want a senator to be there and accumulate too much power, because of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They'd really wrecked everything. So for Egypt. But those guys, we have evidence from papyri that the legions were quite integrated into civic life. So legionary commanders could also serve as judges, for example, in civic cases. They took on some of the trappings of a police force, because the Romans didn't have regular police forces as such. It all varied from place to place. Yeah, and
That's
the legionaries were not supposed to marry legally, but they often had affairs and had kids, but they were not recognized, right? At least at this time, they were not recognized as legitimate. So yeah, there were all kinds of entanglements about that kind of stuff too.
Jared, did you have any questions you need to ask?
No, I'm good. I'm still trying to literally just process. Like, I feel like you could write a massive series set in this time frame in this place. And it'd be like a big long historical drama with different characters coming in and play, and it would be a fascinating read to fictionalize this in a historical sense. But I'm just trying to process it all. So
kind of you to say so. I have no taste for fiction at all. I'm not competent at it. One thing that your comment leads to, though, is I would want to emphasize that for me, these are all the results of experiments. So I think we should all, and I would like everybody to be suspicious, doubtful, careful about any claims. Simple claims that this is how it was. Even my claims, you should doubt everything I say. But this is just my way of putting together the evidence, which I've tried to show you some of it.
If anybody tells you that Rome was like X at all times in all places, probably a good
run
rule
away.
of thumb not to believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, you should have reason to doubt that claim. So.
Well, thanks a ton for coming on, Steve. It was a blast. If people would like to see more of this content, they should hit the like button down below, subscribe, hit the bell, do all the YouTube things. Feel free to comment below if there's anything we didn't cover. Maybe we can cover it in the future, or something you'd like to see from us moving forward. Steve, if people want to see more of your work and your research, where should they go?
Well, I'm retired now, so just leave me alone. No, I'm joking. I'm absolutely joking. I'm honored by this suggestion. I mean, they can read some of my stuff if they would like. This book on the Jewish War, it's just called A History of the Jewish War, 2016, Cambridge University Press. But it's a big book. But what it is a lot of investigations rather than a narrative saying this is all how it happened. It's a set of problems, like how do we, who was this guy Cestius Gallus? That's one chapter. Why did Titus destroy the temple? That's another chapter. But it's looking at all the evidence and saying, what about this explanation, that explanation? So if you're into that kind of thing, and there are a few podcasts out there with other hosts that people could probably find. But anyway, I'm flattered, honored that somebody might be interested. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, guys, be sure to check out Dr. Mason's other work if you're interested. If you're as big a Roman geek as I am, I'm sure it'll be very enlightening. But until next time, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.
Peace out.